they know that smoking's bad for them, but that doesn't help them change. It's when they feel it in their body. So you can think of our thinking brain. It doesn't hold a candle to our feeling body. That's really where cravings and urges and behavior really is driven.
Just so everybody knows, Dr. Judson Brewer, he's the Director of Research and Innovation at the Mindfulness Center at Brown University. You're also Executive Medical Director of Behavioral Health at ShareCare. You got a lot of stuff on your plate, and I've listened to a bunch of your podcasts, or you being on podcasts, other people's podcasts, and your book. But this is my nirvana. Yeah. But thank you for being here. And do you think it is the case that your work is as relevant now? Which is to say, the variety of potential maladies is higher than ever. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair. I've never seen such an addicted population, if that's fair to say. And it's not that our brains have suddenly changed in the last 10 years, but the conditions surrounding our brains have changed tremendously.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you a little, I'm going to personalize this just a tiny bit. So I went to Brown. There's our wonderful gates, right? This right here, this is a little grim, but I would say it's a way to honor a guy I went to school with. So that my best friend at Brown, that's his memorial, and he died of addictive alcohol. Really, is what took Paul out. I'm in recovery, 13 years sober, and my work is really in what I think of as like an overall challenge related to isolation and other factors that has created a scattered and divided culture. So, I sort of think of this quite broadly. I'm going to show an image, just two images actually. This is how I think about college in my day, probably in your day. And this is college today. Yeah, isn't that amazing? I'll pull that back up. I mean, look at that. Look, every one of them everywhere is on this thing. It's staggering. And I don't want to be too sentimental, but I remember this. Don't you? Yeah. And so if you want to know cause and effect, here's part of cause, right? You'd have to say the cultures are really, really different. They're just really, really different. And I in your book you talk about your own, I'm going to call them addictive behaviors. You may not use those exact words, but the idea being that, and I love your definition of it, by the way. So your definition, or maybe you had quoted somewhere else, but continued use despite adverse consequences. And that's a very writ large way of thinking about it, and an accurate way of thinking about it. Would you say that's true?
Yes, and I think it's the American Association of Addiction Medicine. They basically came out with their updated definition that very much is basically that. So I learned that definition in residency, long time ago, and it's more, you can see how, as you put it, writ large, how important that definition is today, because it goes way beyond just chemicals.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's what I would say, the good news generally is that what I have found and what I'm observing is that some of the stigma is dissipating, right? And some of the understanding is growing, which frankly I just think makes everything so much easier. And I don't know. I mean, there's been people addicted to substances for a very, very long time. And so I mean, I assume we're sort of pre-wired for this kind of behavior. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, and it may be worth taking a moment just to explore that a little bit. But just to go back to your previous point, we fear things that we don't understand, and things that we fear we shun or we closet or we try to push away. That's also part of how our brains work. So if you think of this from a very basic survival standpoint, our brains are set up to help us survive, to remember where food is so we can find it again, and to avoid danger. So, and remember where danger is so we can avoid that, the dangerous parts of the savannah. Modern day, our survival brains are still very much at work. It's just that in the modern culture, it's not about, remembering where the food sources are. Everybody has a refrigerator.
I learned about your work, and I've listened to you, as I mentioned a few times, and I'm not done with your book, but I'm a good ways through your book. And by the way, I'm talking about this book, which is, because you have another book coming, which is called, is it officially named?
Yes.
So it's...
The new book is on anxiety. It's called Unwinding Anxiety. It's going to be published by Avery, which is a Penguin imprint, in March of 2021.
Okay, so, and this is the book that I'm reading, The Craving Mind. And I will tell you, and I'm sure I'm not the first to tell you, that I get anxious because my recovery is 12-step focused, right? And when you're in the 12-step world, there's a spirituality component to it that's really predominant. How do you react to my feeling of, it's almost a fear that I have of exploring the scientific boundaries? I do it all the time, by the way. I mean, my recovery is nothing but one 13-year study of this. Like, I read everything. But I have this anxiety when I feel a clash between spirit and science. Do you hear that a lot?
Yeah, I hear that a fair amount. Yet a lot of the, actually my entire lab's research portfolio, so to speak, is based on ancient Buddhist psychology.
Right.
So some would say, well, that's pretty spiritual. And in fact, if you look at the ancient Buddhist psychology, some argue that the Buddha was a psychologist, or a famous teacher, S.N. Goenka, called him a super scientist. And in that sense, he was really just exploring the workings of his own mind. And so you could say, well, that's spiritual, depending on how you define spiritual. You could say, well, that's spiritual, or that's even religious. But even there's this famous saying about the Buddha who said, I teach one thing and one thing only, which is the cause of suffering and its end. Basically, no mysticism here. It doesn't mean that mysticism, doesn't exist or whatnot, but it's just it's separate. You can separate those. And in fact, some of the things that my lab has been studying are those parallels between this ancient Buddhist psychology and modern day science. And in fact, we published a scientific paper, 2013, something like that. And I actually published this with my meditation teacher and a Pali scholar. So there were 3 authors on this paper. And this came from me seeing the parallels between the Buddhist psychology. There was this concept called dependent origination that apparently the Buddha was contemplating on the night of his enlightenment. AKA, or in other words, that's kind of important, probably something worth looking into. So apparently he was contemplating this thing, dependent origination, and that's when he, let's say, got woke. different meaning, but that's when he woke up. That's when he became enlightened. And when I studied this, at first, when I was just studying it personally, I was really struggling with understanding what it meant. But a couple of years into it, I was treating patients in my clinic with addictions and started to realize, wait a minute, this is very, very similar to how the majority, if not all of my patients form their addictions through what's described as reinforcement learning. So I brought this Pali scholar together, started exploring this, and wrote this paper with him and my teacher, Joseph Goldstein, where we just showed the parallels between dependent origination and reinforcement learning. It's sometimes called positive and negative reinforcement. And in fact, Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize in 2000 showing that process is evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. So the science on that is very solid. And the psychological side of that from Buddhism, you can also think of that as being very solid because it has not been outcompeted. Take a Darwinian perspective. It's not been outcompeted in over 2,500 years. Just think about modern day psychoanalysis and all these other, psychological treatments. Psychoanalysis, the Freudian stuff, has been around just over 100 years, and it's not on its upswing, right? It's CBT has been around for about 50 years. Back in Ellis, back in the 60s, we're developing it. That's not on its upswing. There really isn't any. And so think of the half-life there, right?
Yeah.
So this is like thousands of years versus 50 to 100 years. And it's now considered in modern science as one of the next waves, which is ironic because it's been around much longer than any of these.
So I want to go back. And I think you give a really good insight into how these things kind of develop in the first place, these addictive behaviors. Can you just give us a little bit on that?
Sure. It's actually relatively simple. There are 3 elements that are needed to form a habit around a behavior. And this goes back to what I mentioned around survival. So for example, on our ancient ancestors on the savannah who didn't have refrigerators, they had to go find food, and then they had to remember where it was so they could go find it again the next day. And so think of it as 3 elements: a trigger, a behavior, and a reward. So the trigger is that you see the food, you're searching, you see the food. The behavior is that you eat it. When you eat it, your stomach sends this dopamine signal to your brain that says, remember what you found and what you ate and where you found it. So it's interesting that in modern day science, we call that a reward. But you could actually simplify that. If you just keep it at its core elements, that's set up to help us develop context-dependent memory, meaning remember where something is in a particular context. You can also see how that works for avoiding danger, right? You see the danger, that's the trigger, you run away, that's the behavior, and then you survive. That's the reward, so to speak, so that you can remember to avoid that part of the savannah in the future. Now, let's go back to this reward piece. This is purely a scientific term in the sense of reward, because what happens is that dopamine shifts in firing from when we find something. If we find it, so the unexpected, result. Think of a slot machine, right? You don't know when you're going to win, but when you win, your dopamine says, "Wow, that's great. Do it again." And so that kind of gets laid down. This dopamine firing shifts from receipt or the behavior to anticipation of the behavior, and that's where craving comes in. Where it's like food, we find the food, we lay down that memory, and then that dopamine fires and says, get off your butt and go get the food, right? Tomorrow, right? When you're hungry or whatever. And I want to highlight this because in modern day, we've learned to associate that restless quality of experience with reward. Some say dopamine is the pleasure molecule. If you ask any of my patients, when their dopamine fires, they're feeling restless, especially if they're using substances like cocaine, they're feeling paranoid, right? When the cocaine is blocking their dopamine receptor and they're getting a bunch of dopamine in their brain. So restless, paranoid, antsy, all these things. Where's the reward in that? So I think we've really just kind of missed the forest for the trees or whatever, in the sense where people think of dopamine as this reward molecule, but really that's just a scientific term saying that's how our brain learns stuff. And I think that's really important also, and we can get to this later, that's also important in terms of changing behavior. The first step is just understanding how this process works. It's set up to help us remember stuff, period. It's set up to help us learn. And learning habits is a good thing. right? So imagine getting up every morning and having to relearn every single habit that you have, from putting on your clothes to walking to making breakfast. We'd be exhausted by noon.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that, in somewhat depressingly, I discovered about myself is how self-centered I am. And I've known that for a decade now. I don't know I don't know if I knew it at all before that. Honestly, I just thought, I'm a nice guy. That's how I was going through life. And then I discovered, wow, I think about myself a lot, right? And I think people get confused when you sort of think about the concept of humility or ego. You can think about yourself all day long in the negative. You're still thinking about yourself all day long, Yeah. And it's hard for people to sort of see that at first. I mention it though because, you would put it, you may classify it as a value to be selfless or self-centered, or, on one hand self-centered, on the other end selfless. I think I am exactly wired that way. Now, it may have developed over time. I accept. But the unwiring of that is not a matter of just being conscious of it, or at least it hasn't been for me. Now, I may be using the wrong word there when I say conscious. But I also want to say it, and one of the reasons I say this a lot, that I'm self-centered, is because I want other people who are self-centered to be okay with the fact that you are self-centered and work on it. If you hate yourself because you're self-centered, you're not helping yourself.
Well, that's also a self-centered thought, is hating yourself.
Well, exactly. There you go.
So, well, and in case this helps, I totally agree with you. And I would go as far as saying self-centeredness is wired into our brain. There's this brain network that you've probably been reading a little bit about in my book, called the default mode network. And it was named, it wasn't named, but let's come up with a great name for this. But it was actually named by Mark Rakel and his group at Washington University in St. Louis when they discovered it. And it was discovered because when they were doing this fMRI, this brain imaging task, where they were asking people not to do anything in particular. And they found that this network of brain regions kept getting activated over and over and over and over. And they were scratching their heads, and they sat on their data for about 2 years. Dr. Rakel's a very careful scientist. And they realized this is what people default to. And they default to thinking about themselves. So this network, it took about 10 years for people to figure out what it was. But this network gets activated when we regret things that we've done in the past, when we worry about things that that might happen in the future. It also gets activated with depressive rumination. It gets activated with anxious worry, with perseveration, and it gets activated with craving. Now, there's a common thread here, which may not seem obvious. It took us a long time to develop a working hypothesis around this. But the thread is, it's whenever we get caught up in something. So let's go back to the ego piece. We can be caught up in thinking, I'm great, puffy chest. We can also get caught up in, I'm terrible, I'm awful. And there's an experiential quality that we all can touch into here, which is this feeling of contraction or closed downness that comes with that. And that is shared, as I'm sure you know, with craving, right? When there's a craving, it feels contracted. It feels closed down because that contractive quality says, go do something. It doesn't feel good.
I'm pretty much 320 days a year I sit in a room, right? So I've been around, right? I've seen thousands of people come and go and get sick. And so what I'm quite confident in is that these cravings that we're talking about and these psychological states, let's call them, or spiritual states, are vacuums on a level that I think if you haven't been there, it'd be very hard for you to understand. Now, the one thing, but what I would say is I think we've actually all been there. It's just that we don't associate certain of our behaviors with cocaine, for example.
Yes, and I would say we've all been there on a continuum. I think it's hard for people to understand what it feels like if they haven't. So, for example, and I'm glad you bring up the genetics of alcohol, because alcohol affects people very differently based on their genetics. In a more standard way, cocaine blocks the dopamine receptor, or the dopamine transporter, sorry. And so it really floods the brain with dopamine. And it's hard to get a sense of what that feels like naturally, just because it's a very artificial thing that's really, kind of designed. It's really just a refined product of a leaf. But it's there in a way that it is much stronger than most of us can really understand from a natural physiologic process.
Please read The Craving Mind if this is confusing to you, because I think the way you outline it is so helpful. It's just so helpful. And I think people, and I think this kind of awareness of what is a mental illness, and I would argue a spiritual illness, is so helpful to people. And at a minimum, I think, because I don't know that I don't think any of us are not associated with addiction in some way, and some at work, in the family, whatever it might be. And I've been through a lot of interventions where people want to dive right to logic, and I understand why they're relatively naive to what we're dealing with here. But I think if you just had the basic understanding, we'd find more people getting more healthy more often, including yourself, including just some ability to be at peace if you don't sort of see these problems in yourself, but it's around you.
I'm glad you say that. And if I could just add one piece, which is, you mentioned earlier the promise but potential pitfalls of willpower. Neuroscientists don't actually talk about willpower in their models of how the brain works. They talk about cognitive control, but in a very different way, not in the way that we think of as I'm in control, but they talk about it a lot in terms of how rewarding a behavior is. So there's been a lot of really helpful emphasis recently in the addiction field around community and support. Even Nora Volkoff, the head of NIDA, has been really vocal about this. And it makes a lot of sense from a brain perspective. If you think of our brains are always looking for what I call the BBO, the bigger, better offer, right? So there need to be two elements there that help somebody shift from a willpower-based, approach that generally fails to tapping into their brain's strength, which is reward-based learning or reinforcement learning. And the two pieces there are, one, really paying careful attention to the results of the behavior. So I'll give a simple example of smoking. We've done studies in my lab. We've, all this stuff around smoking. And we've particularly done studies with mindfulness training where we help people pay attention as they smoke. In one study, we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. In another study, we actually linked it up to brain mechanisms. So we've really worked this out a bit. But the key here from an experiential standpoint is helping somebody pay attention as they smoke. And they realize that cigarettes taste like crap, right? They know that smoking's bad for them, but that doesn't help them change. It's when they feel it in their body. So you can think of our thinking brain. It doesn't hold a candle to our feeling body. That's really where cravings and urges and behavior really is driven. So if we can see how unrewarding a behavior is, that reward value drops in the brain, and that opens the door for that bigger, better offer. And that bigger, better offer can come in the form of connection, right? If somebody's feeling isolated, that doesn't feel very good, so they might turn to a substance or something like that. And, I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, and that numbs the feeling or distracts them. Well, what if they could actually solve that quote unquote problem with connection, and they get connected? It feels better. So there's that bigger, better offer right off the bat.
Yeah. I mean, this is, before we leave the problem versus the solution, I'm going to mention a commonly used phrase, which I have actually heard, I think I've heard you use, which is the notion of the hole in your soul, right? And so for those of you who don't know, the idea here is that essentially there's a God-shaped hole in your soul. Now, not everyone would put it that way, but that this hole in your soul will be filled. And, as Jung would say, spiritus contra spiritum, the idea is the spirit of, call it a higher power, over spiritum being liquor. But the idea is that this vacuum in you will be filled. And if you can fill it with a better way of living, doing the next right thing, a connection to a God, a connection to another person, where you're going to find your wholeness. And that, some would describe it as that phenomenon of craving disappearing as a miracle to them, because they've never experienced it in their whole life. And so and I've seen that many times. I've seen people say, wow, one day it went away. And after all the attempts, it went away. That's another way of sort of looking at the same thing. Now, I'm going to guess you would say, and obviously you can respond, I just think of these things as incredibly related, and that these are one, and they're not two. But how do you react to that?
In two ways, and I'm gonna pull up a poem because you remind me of this that says it much better than I can. But basically, that spiritum of liquor or whatever this substance is leads to a contracted, closed down quality that doesn't actually feel very good and just cries out for more, right? Through this reinforcement learning process, when we numb ourselves or get high or get, drunk or whatever, that brief relief that comes from that makes us more dependent on that process and on that behavior in the future. So we just get sucked in. And it's not just, substances. This is social media. This is, looking at cute pictures of puppies on Instagram when we're bored, right? It could be as simple as that. So that piece is self-perpetuating and actually digs us deeper into the hole. When we can start to see that it actually feels better to be kind, to be curious, to be connected, that helps us naturally pull out of that, and it's not reinforcing in the same way because it doesn't have this restless quality to it. Kindness doesn't feel restless. It doesn't say, go get more kindness.
Right, right.
Curiosity, when we're truly just fascinated by something, it's open. We're exploring. Our eyes are wide with wonder. And the poem, just give me a second, I'll pull this up. Yeah. But it's called The Worm's Waking by Rumi. And I will pull this up because I was just thinking of this poem.
I love that you're bringing up Rumi, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I think, I went to divinity school and recently. And, if you were to ask me what I am, I'm going to say I don't know, because I don't know. I didn't go to be a this or a that. I'm not a this or a that. But what I found so confounding and interesting there was the degree to which, and I think I've heard you say this. Well, no, it's experience is the whole thing, and books can point you there, and but for me, conversation, being, that's where the answer lies. And Rumi, I think, is among the greatest translators of this. But go ahead. That's my Rumi bit.
Well, I agree. And I think of, its concepts are in the service of wisdom, but they are not wisdom.
Right.
So they can help us, right? Understanding reinforcement learning is helpful for my patients to map out their habit loops so they can overcome them. But their own direct experience is what's going to drive wisdom and future behavior. So I'll just read this briefly because I think this really sums it up. It's called The Worm's Waking. There's a worm addicted to eating grape leaves. Suddenly he wakes up. Call it grace, whatever. Something wakes him. And he's no longer a worm. He's the entire vineyard and the orchard too, the fruit, the trunks, a growing wisdom and joy that does not need to devour. And I love this because it shows how we can move from this closed down, contracted quality of experience into such an open quality where we no longer have a sense of this small self of me, because that contraction said, here I am, and the rest of the world's out here. When that expands so big, as Rumi puts it, we're the entire vineyard. There's just awareness. And with that, a growing wisdom and joy that does not need to devour. Why? Because it feels better. It feels better than wanting.
Yeah. I'm going to show you this. You see that? Gather, wonder, practice. That's our methodology. Gather. You and I are gathering right now. Wonder. Humbly learn. Practice. We have a group of practices that we recommend. And I wanted to show you that because, you used the word wonder just a moment ago. we did this trip recently where we went down the Mississippi River. We drove out to the northern tip all the way to the southern tip and back home, interviewed about 300 people, and we did about 20 live conversations, all during COVID, all on race. And, you know, along the way, we'd meet people who would, like, give us all the no offense, academia. And then you'd hear people, everyday regular people, with tears in their eyes, with anger in their heart, whatever it might be, share. They have the answers. And only wisdom, the wisdom. And it just felt so when I get back, people want me to say white privilege, this, that, or the other thing. I think those things are real. I'm not saying I don't. I'm saying I'm in love with some of the people I met along the way, and I feel sadness for some of the angry people I met along the way, and I feel like a totally different person around such a complicated topic. And so when I say this, and it's frustrating to a certain extent, because people say, oh, it sounds cute, and, no, it's profoundly altering, And why do I do this? Because I sat in a circle day after day, and I went from among the most miserable people I ever knew to someone who's hopeful, and I think a positive part of my family most of the time. I mean, sometimes I'm a jerk, or I'm selfish, or all these other things. And so I just think it's so profound. And so, one of the things that, as we talk about solutions or paths, let's say, the thing I find frustrating, and it's changing pretty dramatically, is that a lot of the words we use, like mindfulness, it's insufficient. It's not enough. Like, I don't think people know what to grab on when they hear that word. You know what I mean?
I'm so glad you say that, because mindfulness is a concept, right? And this shows what you're just talking about in terms of somebody can give some academic answer or definition of something, but that doesn't hold a candle to when you go and talk to the people who've actually had that lived experience. So the word mindfulness is a concept. What does it point to? It points to the direct experience of awareness and curiosity, right? This goes back to your wonder. And when we wonder, what that helps us do, I wonder what that person is feeling. I wonder what that person's life is like. That helps us move from division of I'm right, you're wrong, or I've got the right word, or I'm an academic, or whatever somebody feels the privilege of thinking they have. That helps them move out of their own little box of self-righteousness often, into somebody else's shoes, and helps them walk in their shoes. And when we walk in somebody else's shoes, we feel their pain. And when we feel their pain, we cannot ignore that. And that's where understanding comes from. And that's where connection comes from. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle people are on. We're both in one aisle together, which is human. We're all human. And when we can realize how we're just like somebody else in terms of our common humanity, and we see how much pain somebody might be having, it is hard to ignore that. And it's much easier to be able to develop that direct wisdom to say, oh, here's what's happening. Here's the problem, and stay out of the conceptual world.
Yeah. Again, I just think it's what you're saying is so real. And to the extent that people can experience these things. I mean, I always say we're in a great war that we're not in. We're in a big fight that no one's actually cares that much about. And that war that we get in, I was at a funeral this week, and I was with this woman who's relatively conservative, and her nephew, like, on social media, is so mean to her because of politics. And when she's with him, she's like, he's so sweet, and we get along so well. Same person. It's the same, and, there's certain things that there's probably lines you might say, I wouldn't cross this line or that line. Oh, okay, maybe you wouldn't. But there's a loss of truth in the middle of all of this. I'm talking about truth, like actuality, because we really do live in a dystopia is now. I know that sounds a little negative, but dystopia is. This isn't some future thing. And I'm now walking into sort of the digital world, but I believe that.
Well, and if we look at how that has come to be, the digital world is very much part of this, where, in the pursuit, and I don't want to oversimplify this, but in the pursuit where we have kind of championed making money over all other things, the companies they just have to be set up to make money, because that's how the society has been set up. And so that means they have to drive ad revenue, which means they have to keep people on their platforms longer, which means they've figured out, fake news spreads 6 times faster than real news, and all this stuff where there's this piece where they're like, well, we got to get our ad revenue, so we're going to drive people slowly to more extreme views, because we know that's what holds people on our platform. Not because these places are evil, but it's just because that's the business model that they didn't set up.
Yeah. I'm going to use an analogy. Sorry, you finish.
Well, I was just going to say, and it keeps us away from the real issue, which is our common humanity. And so I don't think people purposely want to be mean to each other, because it's more painful. Kindness trumps meanness all the time. Nobody's going to say, wow, it feels so much better to be mean than to be nice, like if they truly feel into it. But it keeps us away from our direct experience. It keeps us stuck running and running and running in our heads to the point where we don't notice this. So if we can take a breath and step back and start to ground ourselves in direct experience, then we can actually transcend the stuff that's keeping us spinning as a society.
I'm going to show you a promo I made. I wanted to show you this because we're just about to release it, and I think you'll see why I want to show you this, and it'll, I think, lead us into the next part of the conversation I'd like to have.
Technology has simply outcompeted the human brain, undermined our dopamine reward systems. It knows everything about you and traps each of us in our own pre-programmed reality. It's not even an individual choice to opt out. But I've never been more hopeful seeing people waking up to what's happening.
I love it. Stop snorting likes.
Yeah. And and it's meant to be goofy, but it's very real. Am I right?
And humor gets messages across more than many other things, right? Why? Because it opens us.
Yeah.
So we can actually take information in.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you take that approach. It's very effective.
Well, and it's also so you use the word connection. I just love that word. Okay? And I just use the word that I like even more than that, which is love. Because I'm a capitalist. I'm a free market person. I'm a free market person as long as it sits under love every time. If everything sits under love, maybe not everything, but under love, democracy, a market-based economy, on and on, they have a great place. But if you're going to go with capitalism or consumerism, even democracy up here, I just think you're headed for trouble. You're just going to have problems. And that we had this gift of, to a certain extent, of over time, and we're not a perfect union, and of course we're not. However, there was a time when, with the Soviet Union in particular, in our lifetimes, we were unified. We had a love of freedoms and certain things that unified us, and then under that sat our systems. I'm not sure those systems sit under anything anymore.
It's so interesting you bring that up. Do you remember there was a documentary from decades ago called The Corporation?
Yeah.
And it was one piece that I remember from way back then was that they talked about companies. Companies are not evil, but they were set up as typically male dominated, but it was like somebody and sons. And the point that they were making there was that somebody actually took responsibility for their products. So if they were putting out garbage, it was on them. If they were harming people, it was on them. And when they could see that they were directly harming people, their gut says, "Oh, that doesn't feel good. I don't want to do that." But if we can divorce ourselves now from the consequences of what we're doing, it's much easier to do that, which is very similar to social media, when you can just yell at somebody across the internet and not see their face, or not see them crying, or not see them feeling bad. So here it comes back to this love piece, right? Which is something we all have intrinsically. And I think if we can keep it personal, in the sense of, it'd be amazing to see corporations have people see the direct effects of their behaviors on other people. I think that in itself, that awareness would transform how corporations worked. Because who wants to be a CEO where they're directly, it's like, okay, you go and inject that crushed up OxyContin in somebody's vein and see what happens, right? As compared to hiding behind all these levels of where they're not even conscious of it, or not even aware of it. I think this human element would actually, and maybe it's oversimplified, but that piece goes back to what you're talking about with love. That's is tremendously powerful in helping us transform these things from these automated, I'm just a cog in a wheel, to, I'm taking responsibility over the actions of my company.
Yeah. I'm a good friend of a guy who got the first PhD in flow, which I know you talk about. And I would make the argument there's a heavy element of what I would call love that sits within there. Before we go there, though, and I brought that up, though, because I do think it's, the solution is there, like it lies there, but to love will bring us there. Like, to assume that someone's going to turn a switch off or the government's going to stop them, I'm not sure you're going to get very far on that one. Like, I just don't think that's going to work. But before we get into that bigger thing, and that's, I don't want to take too much of your time, but I want to end on that. Before we do that, I'd love you to talk about the role that mindfulness plays in being aware of these behaviors and what that can do, because I think as individuals we could all use that. That would be very useful to us.
Okay. So basically, think of mindfulness. It's a concept, right? Awareness and curiosity, or non-judgment. Just meaning that we bring a fresh attitude to whatever comes up. We don't prejudge things. Okay. So when you think of that, what that helps us do is, I think of it as three steps. And I actually write about this in my new book, the Unwinding Anxiety book, where the first is we have to become aware of our habitual reactions to the world, right? If we're not aware, we're just going to keep going on autopilot. So that's step one. That's what awareness helps us do. Oh, I'm stuck in this thing. Let's use the theme of love. And so if the trigger is that somebody does something that pisses us off, and the behavior is that we yell at them, that result might be that we feel self-righteous or vindicated, or I told them, or whatever, right? And then we get stuck in that. The next time somebody does that, we have to do it more and more and more. So we have to become aware of that, step one. Step two, we have to become aware of the results of that. What are the effects of my behavior? Not just on me, but on them as well, right? Because that's going to come back to me. Oh, somebody felt bad. How does it feel when I make somebody feel bad? That reward value drops, right? That's tapping into our brain's natural reward-based learning system. That's step two. So just seeing the cause and effect relationship of something. I have my patients ask this simple question: what do I get from this? Right? From whatever the behavior is, what do I get from this? Worrying, overeating, smoking, whatever. When they see that it's not that rewarding, that reward value drops, which then leads them to step three. And this is where mindfulness comes in as well. Step three is about stepping out of these habit loops through things like just being curious. When we get curious about what a craving feels like, it's much easier for us to ride it out. When we get, so let's use the love theme. When we see how judgment or, the far end of the spectrum would be meanness or hatred or whatever, when we see really clearly that that's not that rewarding, we can actually replace that with that bigger, better offer of kindness and of connection, right? So kindness and connection, my lab's actually done studies on this, they feel better. People prefer those to anger, to frustration, to anxiety, to all of these things. So that three-step process is all about awareness. Awareness of a habit loop, awareness of how unrewarding the old behavior is, and awareness of how rewarding the new behavior is. And the new behavior could be simply awareness itself, right? Because if we're aware, that actually helps us step out of a process. Think of the observer effect in physics. By observing, you're affecting the result. So simply by observing a craving, you're not as caught up in it. Or simply observing anger, you're not as caught up in it. So those are the three steps that underlie behavior change with mindfulness. And I think this comes back to love. We can feel what it feels like, how contracted, how restless, how unrewarding it feels to be frustrated with somebody, or to be disconnected, or to be in conflict with somebody, and how open and connected it feels when we're not defending ourselves, when we're not being self-righteous, when we're letting go of ego and actually connecting with somebody, which actually fits perfectly with flow. I think you mentioned that earlier, right? Okay. So think of flow being that we've expanded that feeling of contraction so wide that we lose a sense of where the self ends and where the rest of the world begins. That's what Csikszentmihalyi talks about in terms of flow. It's selfless, it's effortless, it's timeless, it's joyful, it's connected, because there's no us.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things I think about a lot is how well our culture tells its story to us. We are so in that story of our culture. And the things you're talking about, the joy of experiencing these kinds of things, it's not that well told. That story is not that well told, unfortunately, but it's a beautiful story. Now, what'll happen is people say, well, what about my new car? Where does my new car fit in there? Or what about my prestige? Where's that in what you just said? And unfortunately, I think some of the things that you discover is that those were always false promises. They were always a false promise. Now, why? Well, because, among the reasons, and we don't have to spend time talking about this, but I think we needed certain things to defeat communism and defeat the Nazis. And God bless we did. And so there was this generation that came of age and said, we need corporations and colleges, and we need to make money and stop the bad guys. And so our whole, our universities and so many things got built around this concept. I'm generalizing here. And, the modern world isn't like that. It's a different thing. The foes are different and the challenges are different. And so, it meant a lot to have great corporations and great CEOs and lots of money and weapons and all these other things. Again, I'm not necessarily against those things, but I think there's a cultural need for what will ultimately result in joy, and I would argue unity. But we need people to communicate it, and it's going to take time.
Yes. And I think one thing you're highlighting, one element of this is that we're very much based on a growth economy, and we've realized that this planet has limited resources. So how do we transform a growth economy into let's say a kindness economy or a connection economy, or just something where it's the incentives are not about growing, but are about taking care of all of us, because ultimately that's what everything is about, is about taking care of ourselves and taking care of others, whether it's our families, our communities, our countries, the world. So how do we do that? And I think this goes back to how, all you need is love, right? It comes back to how much better that feels than selfishness.
Yeah. Well, it just needs a better PR agent, because that's true. What you just said is true. I mean, it does seem to be the promise. If you start paying attention to just how consumerist our culture is, it's everywhere. It is everywhere. I mean, it's things and things and things and things and things. People sing about things. They show things. They tweet about things. They Instagram about things. It's things and things and things. And, part of what, I go back to the community service, department in my high school. That was like what you should do. Like if you want to get into college. It wasn't about joy. It could have been. But I was never taught that. I was never taught community service brings joy. I wasn't taught that. I was taught community service brings college. It's I'm being cynical, but
yeah. No, and it's amazing because it's right there. The reward is right there. If somebody just pointed it out and said, how's it feel after you go and help somebody? oh, it sucks.
Right. That's right. It's funny because I did this trip twice this summer. So I drove 12,000 miles. Me and one guy did Joe, who's sitting over here. We did it twice. And so what didn't I do? That took a long time, by the way. I didn't go boating or fishing or, I didn't do that stuff. I had a great summer. It's great. I was joyful the whole time. But, but definitionally, well, you got to go on vacation and you got to go do this and you got to go do that. I'm like, really? Says who? When did that become the rule? Can we just talk before we go? I want to talk about connection. And in my case, so what we do, what's called the neighborhood in our organization is really, think of it like a video book club. And we make a lot of films and we only release them within our own ecosystem. And the purpose of the films is meaning, right? They have to tell a story, but we're constantly on a meaning search. And part of what they do is they deliver things like authenticity. These are boring words, unfortunately. I wish I could come up with better ones, but authenticity, vulnerability, candor, and those kinds of things. So it's this deeper, faster modeling opportunity so that the result is conversation. That's the whole idea. And when you start to think about moderators and all these other things, skip that part. Let's just go to storytelling, shared experience, conversation, and then connection, which again, every word I said, I like the way you put it, is I'm just pointing. We're just pointing. It's not the answer isn't in what I just said. The answer is in the experience with what I just said. Now that's part of connection, but react to that. I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
So when we hear a story, we imagine the characters. We're in the character's shoes, especially if these stories are about people, and we can put ourselves in their shoes. So we're already developing a connection through that storytelling and coming together in groups where it's not some hierarchical method of, I'm going to impart, wisdom, quote unquote, on you, because it doesn't work that way. So you get rid of the hierarchy as you're talking about, and then people can open up. And, I don't care if the word authentic is trite or as you put it, boring. That's the truth. Authenticity, you can't trump authenticity. And that only emerges when people feel safe and connected.
I'm going to bring this back up because I in the future, I would love to talk to you about this. And it's this book, The Immortality Key. And he's a Brown grad. I'm going to be talking to him next week. I bring it up for the following reason. When I was at Brown, I met Timothy Leary. He was speaking there, and I was in the bookstore. I was walking through the bookstore, and he was backstage. I wasn't going to go to the thing, never heard of the guy, didn't know anything about him. Handed me his book. We struck up a conversation, and I developed a relationship with him over time, and I had some of those experiences back in those days. And it was profound. It was way more than smoking a joint. And we don't need to get into, but there's something going on there that's very interesting. And the thing that this book talks about is the unnamed religion, right? Which is, this would be my interpretation of it. My interpretation of it is some view of radical existence that elicits the far end of what I would call a meditative experience. That to me is what this book is about. And well, he goes deeper than that, and he suggests that this is where religion came from. This is where the mystics found their truths, Rumi, etc. What I love about it is this is my prediction. This book will open up a new look inside radical connectedness. And because of the wonder it's going to create culturally, we'll start exploring new bounds. Now that's a big statement, but I hope you read the book, but even without reading the book, how do you react to what I just said?
Well, it speaks to a lot of even the neuroscience work that's been happening more recently with things like psychedelics, the ingredients in magic mushrooms. When we first published our first neuroimaging study on experienced meditators, and we found that the default mode network was deactivated in experienced meditators, they're not getting caught up in themselves as much, basically. 2 months later, the group led by David Nutt and Robin Carhart-Harrison at the University College London published their first study of intravenous administration of psilocybin. And they found basically the exact same thing that we found. So you can think of psychedelics as a way to, literally they're called mind-expanding drugs because people get the sense of the loss of sense of self because that contracted quality of experience is gone. And what our studies showed is that you can actually train people to do that. And what I would suggest for all of us is at any one moment, think of this as a vector. We're either pointed toward more contraction or less contraction, pointed toward contraction or toward openness. And if we can just pay attention to that, what does contraction feel like versus openness? We can see which one's more painful. Contraction feels more painful. My lab's done studies on that. And then we can see, well, what is it that leads to contraction and what is it that leads to expansion? And we know what leads to contraction, greed, cravings, things like that. What leads to expansion? Kindness, connection, curiosity. And then we can just train ourselves to always be looking out for when we're contracted, what's led to that, see how painful it is so our brains naturally don't want to do that again. And then we can train ourselves to pay attention to what led to openness, connection. Back to the public service projects, in high school. If we teach kids to see what's it feel like when you're kind to somebody, they're going to naturally move in that direction. Darwin even suggested this in his famous book. I'm blanking on the name right now, but the one about evolution, So it's there in the science, but more importantly, because those are concepts, it's there in our own direct experience. We all have the wisdom within us. It's just a matter of awakening it. As Rumi said, the worm's waking, We open to that wisdom and joy that does not need to devour.
The thing I love about the craving mind, the thing I love about your work, is that the complexities are so many, and the problems are so real, but the solutions are less elusive than I think we think they are.
Yes.
And that I think is just so productive. So to me, in sum, it's the notion of addictive behavior and the phenomenon that goes along with that. And I'm just going to say difficult lives, difficult family lives, difficult organizational lives, death in some cases. Don't limit it in your thinking to some substances. It's a broader problem.
Yes.
The solution is as necessary now as it's ever been because we have this added layer of information overload.
Yes.
Like we are really challenged to find a center. And so to the extent that you are able to, what I would call clarity, to pursue clarity and find it, your life's going to get better and our lives are going to get better by virtue of that. And I can't imagine there's anything more important than that.
Amen, brother.
You're with me.
I am.
Why do you do this? Before we go, what gets you out of bed?
Well, what does it feel like to help the world versus harm it? Whether it's working with my clinic patients or doing the research to help the world understand, what can lead us to a better place, and that these are pretty simple, awareness, which leads to helping people see how kindness, curiosity, and connection feel better than meanness. I can't think of anything else I'd rather be doing.